If you're interested in getting started in film photography, a popular way to do it is with a camera like this, one of the compact rangefinder cameras of the 1970s. Unfortunately, a lot of these cameras now are found with dead meters, either because the wiring has been eaten up by battery corrosion or because the sensing cell simply no longer works. Sometimes you can get this repaired, but often you can't, either because the parts are no longer available or the labor is simply far more than the camera is worth. Another great way to get started in film photography is with one of the classic vintage rangefinder cameras of the 1950s and 60s from Leica, Canon, Nikon, or Contax. But all of these cameras were manufactured without meters built into them. Some of the manufacturers got around this by offering add-on meters that couple to the camera's controls, and if you can find a good one, this is still a good solution today. But finding one that's clean, accurate, and works properly isn't always easy. Fortunately, today's market has been flooded recently with small, inexpensive clip-on meters that make it easy to add a meter to a camera that never had one, or to replace one that doesn't work anymore. Today, I'm going to look at a couple of options. One is a new contender that comes from a new company, Reflex Labs. The other is from a fairly well-known Chinese lens maker, TTArtisan. As you can see, the TTArtisan meter on the right is quite small, and the Reflex Labs meter is even smaller. There's also a fairly big difference in how they work. The Reflex Labs meter has control buttons and an LCD display. The TTArtisan meter has more traditional control dials and plus, minus, and centered LED indicators. But first, if you're a bit skeptical, which I am, you probably have one big question. How can these be so cheap? After all, the Voigtlander speed meter, the one that clearly inspired the TTArtisan's meter, costs a couple of $100. The TTArtisan, a near knockoff in appearance, is less than $100, and the Reflex Labs meter is even less expensive. Well, here's what's going on. Throughout most of the history of light metering, the light sensors couldn't be manufactured with very much precision from one unit to the next. To get around that, meter manufacturers had to use hand-selected components and calibrate each meter individually, as the guys at Fix Old Cameras are doing here. But now, the chip-making industry has learned how to produce pre-calibrated sensors that come right off the production line almost perfectly identical. And instead of needing a lot of precision-matched components and individualized adjustments, all the heavy lifting can be done by a high-powered microprocessor like this ST-M32. In the TTArtisan meter, this single high-powered 32 MHz ARM Cortex chip handles all the power management, display driving, and sensor reading, and it's super cheap. Another question you might reasonably ask is, are they accurate? But contrary to what you might see on some YouTubers' channels, you can't really measure a meter's accuracy unless you have a calibrated light source, which I don't and hardly anybody else does either. What you can do is compare the various meters that you're accustomed to using to see whether they match up. I tried the TTArtisan and Reflex Labs meters against a couple of my other meters in both dim and bright light, and their readings actually matched up pretty well, usually within a third to a half a stop. Your biggest reason for preferring one of these meters over the other probably will come down to the way they work. Let's take a look at the TTArtisan meter first. It has two control wheels calibrated for f-stops and shutter speeds, and a smaller inner wheel that you turn to set the ISO value. To make a reading, you press the measuring button on the back, and then manipulate the two control wheels until the center green LED comes on. If you're over, a plus LED will come on, and if you're under, a minus LED will come on. By the way, I found all the control wheels pretty firmly damped, and I didn't have any problems with them slipping during normal operation. The Reflex Labs meter works more like a modern camera with shutter or aperture priority. When you first get it out of the box, you install the battery and then turn it on by pressing the reading button on the back. Your first task will be to set the ISO speed, which you do by holding down the right-hand up button for about 2 seconds until an ISO indicator appears. Once you see that, you can use the up and down buttons to select the ISO you want to use. Fortunately, the meter does remember your choice until either you change it again or you change the battery. Once your ISO is set, you need to decide whether you want to set your shutter speed and read out apertures, or set your aperture and read out shutter speeds. The meter calls this time value or aperture value, and you can change it from one to the other by double-clicking the reading button on the back. Speaking of batteries, you'll need to change them at least once every year, and they both use coin cell lithium batteries. On the Reflex Labs meter, the battery lives in a little plastic drawer which is released by a fingernail busting catch on one side. Then the drawer just slides out. The drawer isn't attached to the meter, so make sure you don't lose it, although they do give you a spare that comes in the package. The process is similar on the TTArtisan meter, but it does put up a little more of a struggle. You have to use a cross-point screwdriver, which they don't supply, to remove a screw on the back, then lift out a plate and use a flat blade screwdriver to pry the lithium battery out of its holder. It's kind of an annoying process, so I skipped showing it here. So far, both of these little meters are stacking up pretty well, but they both have the same Achilles heel, visibility. The TTArtisan meter can have problems both in really poor light, where the numbers on the dials are hard to read, and in really bright light, which can wash out the readout LEDs. The Reflex Labs meter has no problem in bright light, but in dim light it's also hard to read because the LCD has no backlight. They're both fine in moderate light, but if you want to do really low light photography, you'll probably need a more sophisticated meter with an illuminated display. So both these little meters are basic featured but useful, and they both can be a good solution if you have a camera with either no meter or a dead meter. But in a head-to-head competition, which one would you buy? For me, the Reflex Labs meter is the obvious winner. It's smaller, it's less expensive, and it's quicker to operate. Just one press on the button and you immediately get a reading displayed that you can set on your camera. But if you're the kind of photographer who likes to work at a lower pace, you might prefer using the dials and the traditional display of the TTArtisan meter. And that display does have one important advantage. If you forget your readings, you can just look at the dials. On the Reflex Labs meter, once the display is powered off, you can't get it back again without taking another reading. Either way, it's up to you. There's probably room for both these little meters in the photosphere.